When a land is two-thirds Arab, who decides to split it differently, and why? Two rival superpowers made a shocking, united choice that would ignite a conflict the world still feels today.
What is the truth about the 1947 UN Partition Plan and the creation of Israel? It is widely remembered as the moment the world peacefully legislated a Jewish state into existence, but the reality is far darker.
The map drawn by the United Nations in 1947 was supposed to be a triumph of international diplomacy, an elegant solution to a decades-old conflict. Instead, it was a geographic absurdity that satisfied almost no one. It didn't prevent a war, it guaranteed one. And the borders it proposed look absolutely nothing like the Middle East we know today.
How did the United Nations end up with the power to carve up the Middle East in the first place? The story actually begins 30 years earlier, in the trenches of World War I, with a dying empire and a desperate British military.
During the First World War, the British Empire needed allies to help defeat the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled Palestine for centuries. To secure support, British diplomats made sweeping promises of independence and territory. The problem? They essentially double-booked the exact same strip of land to two completely different groups, planting the seeds for a century of bloodshed.
What exactly did the British promise, and to whom? It is staggering to realize that the modern Middle East conflict was heavily shaped by a handful of letters sent by British aristocrats who had never even visited the land.
In 1915, the Hussein McMahon correspondence promised Arab leaders independence across the Middle East in exchange for fighting the Ottomans. But just 2 years later, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, a single 67-word typed letter promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Britain thought they were making shrewd wartime alliances, but they had created an impossible paradox.
When the British Mandate officially began, who actually owned the land they were fighting over? A common myth is that the territory was neatly divided between private Arab and Jewish estates, just waiting for a border. The reality of land ownership in Mandate Palestine was incredibly complex. By 1947, Jewish private landholdings accounted for roughly 7% of the territory. Arab private landholdings made up about 20%. The vast majority, over 70% of the land, wasn't privately owned by either group. It was British state land, inherited from the collapsed Ottoman Empire.
Why did the British Empire, at the height of its global influence, suddenly abandon its mandate in 1947? After 3 decades of trying to reconcile their contradictory promises, the British found themselves trapped in a terrifying spiral.
By 1947, Britain was financially ruined by World War II and utterly exhausted by the relentless violence in Palestine. Jewish militias were waging a fierce insurgency against British forces, while Arab uprisings had previously paralyzed the territory. Unable to keep the peace and unwilling to shed more British blood, the empire simply gave up, walked away, and dumped the problem on the newly formed United Nations.
How did the UN attempt to divide a land where the populations were so deeply and unevenly intertwined? In 1947, the demographic reality on the ground made drawing a clean border mathematically and geographically impossible.
The population was 67% Arab and 33% Jewish. Yet the UN Partition Plan allocated roughly 56% of the land to the Jewish state. Worse, the borders were so fragmented that the proposed countries looked like a shattered stained glass window, only connecting at microscopic kissing points. The proposed Jewish state would have had a nearly 45% Arab minority from day one.
How did the world react to a partition plan that seemed destined to fail? The fate of Resolution 181 culminated in a historic vote at the UN General Assembly, producing an alliance that shocked the globe. At the dawn of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did the unthinkable. They teamed up to vote for the creation of Israel. The 1947 UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, attempted to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, but the geographically absurd map was immediately rejected by the Arab population. Instead of a peaceful division, the resolution ignited a brutal civil war and a subsequent regional conflict that left Israel with 78% of the land.
Surprisingly, the envisioned Palestinian state was swallowed not just by Israel, but by neighboring Arab nations like Jordan and Egypt, leaving a shattered map that continues to define the Middle East today.
What happened to the people trapped inside these microscopic borders before a single official line was drawn? The UN vote in November 1947 didn't bring independence. It brought an immediate descent into chaos.
Months before Israel even declared independence, a brutal civil war erupted. Jewish residents in besieged Jerusalem survived on starvation rations of just 2 pounds of potatoes for Passover. Both sides committed horrific civilian massacres, like the killings at Deir Yassin, the Hadassah convoy ambush, and Kfar Etzion. The UN had drawn a map on paper, but the actual borders of the Middle East were about to be carved in fire. What is the truth about the 1947 UN Partition Plan, also known as Resolution 181, and the creation of Israel?
It is widely remembered as the definitive diplomatic triumph that formally birthed the Jewish state. But the true story, hidden behind the UN gavels, involves double-crossed empires, a bizarrely fragmented map, and a rare Cold War miracle that ultimately ignited a catastrophic regional war instead of establishing a peaceful two-state solution.
To understand the impossible task handed to the United Nations, we have to look backward. How did the British Mandate of Palestine become such a tangled, volatile diplomatic nightmare by 1947 that the British Empire simply threw up its hands and walked away?
The chaos was rooted in World War I, when Britain essentially double-booked the exact same strip of land to 2 different groups. In the 1915 Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, they promised Arab independence to secure an alliance against the Ottomans. Then, a single 67-word typed letter in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. By 1947, Britain was exhausted by the resultant violence and dumped the problem on the newly formed UN.
With the British abandoning their mandate, the United Nations faced a daunting geographic puzzle. Why was physically dividing this land between Jews and Arabs considered practically impossible by so many observers on the ground?
The core issue was that the populations were deeply intertwined and land ownership didn't match the demographic reality. In 1947, the population was roughly 67% Arab and 33% Jewish, yet private landholdings were incredibly small. Jewish residents privately owned roughly 7% of the land, while Arab residents owned about 20%. The vast majority, over 70% of the territory, was technically British state land, leaving no clear geographic lines to follow.
Faced with this deeply mixed population and a massive swath of unowned state land, how did the United Nations Committee ultimately decide to slice up the territory for the 2 proposed nations?
The UN Special Committee drafted a map that heavily favored the minority population in terms of sheer acreage. They allocated 56.47% of the total land to the proposed Jewish state, despite the Jewish population making up only 1/3 of the total residents. Meanwhile, the Arab state was allocated 42.88%. This disproportionate division immediately fueled intense resentment among the Arab majority, who felt they were being forced to pay the price for European anti-Semitism.
While the Jewish state received the majority of the physical land, did this generous UN allocation actually guarantee a secure, overwhelming demographic majority for the newly envisioned nation to safely establish its government? Surprisingly, no. Because the populations were so thoroughly mixed, the proposed Jewish state would have contained a razor-thin demographic margin from day one. The UN borders encompassed roughly 498,000 Jews and 407,000 Arabs. This meant the new Jewish nation would have launched with a nearly 45% Arab minority. It was a demographic powder keg, forcing hundreds of thousands of people into a state they fundamentally opposed. With such a volatile demographic mix trapped inside these proposed borders, how did the UN Partition Plan's map attempt to physically separate these 2 intertwined nations without forcing massive, immediate population transfers?
The UN resorted to drawing a geographically absurd map that looked like a shattered piece of glass. The territory was sliced into 3 Jewish sections and 3 Arab sections, intertwined like a checkerboard. To allow these fragmented states to function, the borders only connected at microscopic, vulnerable intersections known as kissing points. It was a cartographic fantasy, a map designed in a New York boardroom that was entirely undefendable on the actual ground. When this bizarre, undefendable map was finally brought to a vote at the General Assembly, what was the ultimate truth about the passage of Resolution 181 and its immediate, devastating aftermath? At the dawn of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did the unthinkable. They teamed up to vote for the creation of Israel. The 1947 UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, attempted to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, but the geographically absurd map was immediately rejected by the Arab population. Instead of a peaceful division, the resolution ignited a brutal civil war and a subsequent regional conflict that left Israel with 78% of the land. Surprisingly, the envisioned Palestinian state was swallowed not just by Israel, but by neighboring Arab nations like Jordan and Egypt, leaving a shattered map that continues to define the Middle East today.
With the UN's meticulously drafted map completely obliterated by war before it could ever be implemented on the ground, what is the lasting legacy of Resolution 181 for the modern Middle East?
Resolution 181 provided the crucial international legal framework for Israel's declaration of independence, but it utterly failed to create peace. The borders of the new nation weren't drawn by UN diplomats with pens, but by soldiers with rifles during the bloody 1948 war. The failure of the Partition Plan left unresolved territorial and demographic wounds that have festered for decades, cementing a cycle of conflict that continues to shape the geopolitical reality of the world today.
What is the truth about the 1947 UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, and the creation of Israel? How did a diplomatic vote in New York trigger a war that permanently shattered the map of the Middle East?
Behind the polished mahogany desks of the United Nations, delegates believed they were solving a decades-old crisis. Instead, they were lighting a fuse. The Partition Plan was meant to be a masterpiece of international compromise, but in reality, it was a geographic nightmare that would unleash unprecedented bloodshed before the ink even dried.
When the United Nations took over the problem from an exhausted British Empire in 1947, how did they actually decide to divide the land between Arabs and Jews?
They looked at a map where over 70% of the territory was technically British state land. Private ownership was minimal, roughly 20% Arab and 7% Jewish. Yet the UN allocated 56% of the total land to the Jewish population, even though they comprised only a third of the people living there.
If the UN gave 56% of the land to 33% of the population, how did the actual demographics of that specific Jewish territory break down? Could it even survive?
Barely. The proposed Jewish state was a demographic tightrope, containing roughly 498,000 Jews and 407,000 Arabs, a nearly 45% Arab minority from day one. Worse, the borders were a fragmented checkerboard. The proposed Arab and Jewish states were tangled together, only connecting at microscopic, indefensible intersections known as kissing points.
Did anyone truly believe this bizarre intersecting map of kissing points and demographic razor edges could be peacefully implemented? Or was the United Nations simply handing both sides a blueprint for immediate, inevitable conflict?
It was a blueprint for disaster. The Arab population immediately rejected the geographically absurd map. Instead of a peaceful transition, the resolution ignited a brutal civil war, months before Israel even declared independence. In besieged Jerusalem, trapped Jewish residents were reduced to starvation rations, surviving on just 2 pounds of potatoes for Passover.
As the British simply gave up and began packing their bags to leave, how far did the escalating violence go before a single official border could actually be established by either side?
It descended into horrific civilian massacres. On April 9, 1948, Zionist militias killed over 100 Palestinian Arabs at Deir Yassin. Days later, Arab forces ambushed the Hadassah medical convoy, killing 78 Jewish doctors and patients. By May, Arab militias slaughtered 127 Jewish defenders at Kfar Etzion. The land was drowning in blood.
With the British Mandate collapsing into absolute carnage, how did the world's two emerging superpowers, locked in the early, freezing tensions of the Cold War, react to the chaos unfolding over the Holy Land?
They did the unthinkable. In a rare historic anomaly at the dawn of the Cold War,
the United States and the Soviet Union actually teamed up. Both superpowers voted in favor of the Partition Plan and the creation of Israel, each driven by their own strategic desires to push the British Empire out of the Middle East.
Armed with the backing of the superpowers, but facing the absolute rejection of the local Arab population, what was the ultimate, devastating result of Resolution 181's attempt to partition Palestine?
At the dawn of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did the unthinkable. They teamed up to vote for the creation of Israel. The 1947 UN Partition Plan attempted to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, but the geographically absurd map was immediately rejected by the Arab population. Instead of a peaceful division, the resolution ignited a brutal civil war and a subsequent regional conflict that left Israel with 78% of the land. Surprisingly, the envisioned Palestinian state was swallowed not just by Israel, but by neighboring Arab nations like Jordan and Egypt, leaving a shattered map that continues to define the Middle East today.
When the smoke finally cleared and the armistice lines were drawn in 1949, what did this shattered, unrecognizable map mean for the future of the Middle East and the people living there?
It meant that lines drawn in diplomatic ink were forever replaced by borders carved in blood. The UN's attempt to neatly divide the land failed catastrophically, leaving a legacy of displacement, occupation, and enduring trauma. The ghost of Resolution 181 still haunts the region, a shattered map that continues to dictate the modern conflict today.
We started by asking, the 1947 UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, and the creation of Israel. And the answer? At the dawn of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did the unthinkable. They teamed up to vote for the creation of Israel. The 1947 UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, attempted to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, but the geographically absurd map was immediately rejected by the Arab population. If this changed how you see things, share it with someone who needs to hear it.